Freedom feels like a promise and secretly like a prison when we first consider it. The opening idea must hook because freedom is both terrifying and intoxicating in equal measure. In this video, we will chase that contradiction through history, thought, and the small choices you make every morning. We begin by asking the basic question most people avoid for a long time. What does freedom actually mean when philosophers attempt to define it carefully? The answer reveals moral puzzles and political trade-offs that shape societies and private lives in surprising ways. Many traditions have tried to name the shape of human freedom across centuries of thought. Each tradition speaks from its own cultural fears and hopes, creating different images of what it means to be free. We will move through ancient Greek thought, Enlightenment arguments, Eastern traditions, and modern political theory to draw lines between them and to look for patterns that survive across time and culture. In ancient Greece, freedom often meant participation in political life for a certain privileged class of people. For thinkers like Aristotle, freedom was tied to civic virtue and the capacity to shape common life, rather than mere absence of restraint. That context matters because when philosophers spoke of freedom, they assumed social roles and responsibilities that modern readers might miss, and those assumptions change how freedom is realized in practice. Across the Mediterranean came another claim: freedom as autonomy, the ability to govern oneself by reason and principle. Stoic thinkers pushed this inward, arguing that true freedom lives inside the mind regardless of external chains. The Stoic image of a free person is paradoxical, because someone shackled could be freer inside than a seemingly free person who is ruled by passions and fears, a contrast that will guide our later discussion. Fast forward to the Enlightenment, and the language of natural rights reframed freedom as absence of arbitrary interference. Writers like John Locke insisted freedom meant being left alone to pursue life, liberty, and property without unjust coercion. This strand of thought birthed modern liberalism and its stress on individual rights, a powerful idea that reshaped nations and created new spaces for human flourishing along with new conflicts. Isaiah Berlin later made a crucial distinction that sits at the center of modern debates about freedom. He separated negative liberty, freedom from interference, from positive liberty, freedom to be master of oneself and to realize one's purposes. This distinction is not merely academic, because political systems emphasize one over the other, and those choices create very different societies with different pressures and promises. Negative liberty focuses on removing external obstacles and keeping power at bay, a straightforward plea for personal space and legal protections. Many modern democracies are built primarily on this idea, designing institutions to limit arbitrary rule and protect individual choice. But negative liberty alone can neglect social conditions that prevent meaningful choice, like poverty, lack of education, or discrimination that silently narrows the range of real possibilities people face each day. Positive liberty asks a harder, more demanding question: what makes someone genuinely free to pursue their goals, rather than merely formally permitted to do so? This version of freedom demands resources, capabilities, and often collective action to create real opportunity. Positive liberty fuels arguments for welfare, education, and public health, because advocates contend that without certain social goods, people cannot exercise their freedoms in any meaningful way. The tension between negative and positive liberty is more than a theoretical quarrel. It is a lived political tug-of-war. When societies prioritize one form of liberty, they can inadvertently restrict the other, creating trade-offs that are hard to resolve. Our task is not to declare a permanent winner, but to understand the strengths and limits of each conception and to explore how they might be balanced in practice and policy. Beyond politics, freedom interacts intimately with responsibility in a dance that defines mature ethical life. Freedom without responsibility slides into license, where choices become reckless and social bonds fray under the weight of unbounded desire. Conversely, responsibility without freedom becomes a form of servitude where people follow rules mindlessly, losing the capacity to act from moral judgment and personal integrity. License is the seductive form of freedom that ignores consequences and treats freedom as a permission to indulge every whim. Many modern dilemmas, from social media excess to environmental exploitation, stem from this confusion of freedom with license. Understanding the difference requires cultivating moral imagination and social awareness, because freedom that harms others undermines the very social conditions that sustain freedom for everyone. Stoicism offers a powerful perspective that reframes freedom as inner mastery rather than external conditions. Stoic thinkers taught that the only things truly under our control are our judgments and responses, and there lies our real freedom. This teaching does not deny political or material constraints, but it redirects attention to where agency is most reliable and resilient, the disciplined mind choosing meaning in any circumstance. The Stoic practice of focusing on inner freedom can feel austere at first, but it yields surprising resilience when external freedom is limited. People who cultivate inner discipline can keep dignity and purpose even under severe constraints for modern life. Stoic practices translate into small daily disciplines, like choosing reactions deliberately, training attention, and aligning habits with deeper values rather than fleeting impulses. Freedom and responsibility are not enemies but partners in a healthy polity and psyche, and the balance between them requires constant negotiation. Laws, norms, and institutions must create space for agency while channeling it toward mutually beneficial ends. Philosophers across traditions often converge on the idea that freedom flourishes inside networks of trust, obligation, and shared purpose, rather than in isolation or chaos. How, then, do we practically balance freedom with responsibility in everyday life without becoming moralists or libertines? The answer begins with small practices that cultivate judgment and empathy before law or policy is invoked. Simple habits like asking who benefits, who is harmed, and what alternatives exist can transform abstract freedom into responsible action that sustains relationships and common goods. Education plays a vital role because freedom without the capacity to reason and reflect is fragile and easily manipulated. Teaching critical thinking, history, and civics strengthens negative liberty by helping citizens resist coercion and positive liberty by enabling meaningful choice. This is why democratic societies invest in public education as a way to enlarge both kinds of freedom over time, though this investment is always contested and never complete. Economics also shapes freedom because material conditions delimit the freedom available to most people in practical terms. Without stable wages, healthcare, and housing, the choice to pursue projects or engage politically becomes a luxury few can afford. Policy debates about basic income, healthcare, and social safety nets are therefore debates about the practical extension of meaningful freedom into the domain of everyday life. Freedom is also psychological, not only political, and the inner landscapes of fear and desire often determine the shape of outward freedom. Anxiety and addiction shrink horizons and make choices narrower, while courage and curiosity expand possibilities and invite risk. Cultivating psychological freedom requires honest work, sometimes therapy, and often communities that provide support and accountability for long-term growth and change. The moral imagination matters because people must be able to foresee the consequences of their actions to exercise freedom responsibly. Empathy extends the circle of concern and aligns personal liberty with collective flourishing art literature. And storytelling play a subtle role here by teaching us what it feels like to inhabit other lives and thus broadening the moral context in which freedom is lived. Institutions must be designed to balance freedom and constraint with humility, because no single design perfectly realizes liberty for everyone. Checks and balances, transparent law, and accountable power structures limit abuses while protecting personal autonomy. Effective institutions are not rigid. They evolve with changing social needs and new understandings of what freedom requires in different historical moments. Technology complicates freedom because it can simultaneously extend and restrict agency in unexpected ways. Social media expands speech while shaping attention, and algorithms optimize convenience while shaping choices toward hidden ends. Ethical design, transparency, and democratic oversight are necessary if technology is to enhance rather than erode meaningful human freedom in the coming decades. We must also guard against the tyranny of perfection when discussing freedom. Expecting complete autonomy or absolute responsibility is a recipe for shame and paralysis. Human freedom is messy and partial, a practice rather than an attained state. Accepting imperfection opens space for growth, dialogue, and shared learning, because freedom is best exercised in communities that allow mistakes and encourage repair rather than seeking irreversible punishments. Practical wisdom, or phronesis, is the ancient skill that helps translate freedom into good action within complex situations. It involves judgment, timing, and the ability to balance competing goods in the face of uncertainty. Developing practical wisdom requires mentors, reflective practice, and learning from successes and failures rather than simply accumulating theoretical knowledge about liberty. When people cultivate small habits that align action with values, freedom becomes tangible and sustained rather than fleeting and performative. Practices like setting boundaries, choosing attention, and committing to projects shape character and expand liberty incrementally. These habits are the scaffolding of freedom, and they operate quietly in the background of an examined life, producing resilience that policy or rhetoric alone cannot provide. Freedom also requires humility, because the expression of our liberty affects others and sometimes requires sacrifice for shared goods. Recognizing our interconnectedness tempers individualism and frames freedom as a capacity exercised within social responsibilities. This perspective helps reconcile political disagreements by shifting focus from absolute claims to negotiated spaces where plural values can coexist under mutually agreed constraints. History shows that extremes on either side of the freedom spectrum produce predictable harms. Unchecked freedom often breeds inequality and instability, while excessive constraint corrodes creativity and dignity. Balance is not a static midpoint, but an ongoing adjustment. We must therefore design systems and cultivate dispositions that can adapt, repair, and distribute opportunities for meaningful choice across generations and communities. A modern practice for protecting freedom could begin each week with a simple reflective ritual about how our choices affected others. This ritual helps convert abstract ideals into personal accountability and creates actionable plans for change. Small communal practices scale into cultural norms, and when communities value both liberty and mutual care, the result is a more robust, flourishing freedom for more people. The final lesson is a philosophical twist. Freedom is not merely the removal of chains nor the provision of resources, but the cultivation of the inner capacity to respond rightly to life. True freedom is a relationship between self, others, and the world, tested in daily choices. This means the greatest defenders of liberty may be ordinary people practicing humility, courage, and care in small actions that aggregate into powerful social virtues over time. If you want practical steps to live more freely without harming others, begin with 3 practices that transform abstract ideals into embodied habits. First, set boundaries that protect your attention and values, and refuse to confuse availability with authenticity. Second, Practice empathetic imagination by listening to those with different experiences and allowing their perspectives to shape your choices, expanding the moral horizon in which freedom is exercised. Third, cultivate small public goods through acts of stewardship, whether volunteering, voting thoughtfully, or supporting institutions that preserve freedoms for others. These small investments build collective capacity and reduce the likelihood of coercive or arbitrary repairs. Taken together, these practices show how personal discipline, social imagination, and civic engagement combine to form a lived freedom that resists both tyranny and license. Our journey through the philosophy of freedom ends where it began, but with a different view. Freedom is a craft learned slowly, not an entitlement shouted into the void. It requires knowledge, institutions, character, and the humility to accept limits as forms of protection rather than mere restraint. If this exploration gave you a clearer sense of what it means to be free and how to nurture that freedom responsibly, then you have begun practicing the art that philosophers have practiced for centuries. In closing, remember that freedom prospers where people take responsibilities seriously and institutions remain accountable and humble. The balance between liberty and constraint is an ongoing civic project, and every small choice matters to the overall health of that project. If this video gave you a new perspective, consider subscribing and joining a community that values thoughtful conversation about ideas that actually shape our lives.